Hello and welcome. Good to see everyone here. Second day of reInvent. I love this show. This is always a great show. I like talking on the stage because I get a place I can actually walk, which is unlike the hallways around here. My name's Lee Atchison. I've been in the industry for about 29 years. I work at New Relic. I'm a principal cloud architect at New Relic. I've been there for about 5 years. And before New Relic, I was working for Amazon and AWS for about 7 years. I ran a team that built Elastic Beanstalk is one of the things I worked on. My specialty is primarily service, microservice architectures, scalability, availability, those sorts of topics. So behind every app, there are teams. These are not just developers, but operations, customer support, executives, marketing, teams of all shapes and sizes, and they're all running a digital business. A digital business is a team sport, and this team sport requires data. So to run your business, you need data, but what data do you need? And how do you know the right questions to ask about that data? Am I open for business? Are my customers engaging me? How is my business doing? Asking the right questions enables you to identify silos and allows you to tie these things together. This allows you to understand how this impacts your customers, your business, and it tells you if it can impact in a positive or a negative way. The right questions will identify areas of opportunity for you. The most important questions lead to the ability and the need for constant change. Whether that change is the application itself or the infrastructure or your business expectations, change is always happening. Yesterday at a previous talk I gave, I talked about the difference between static and dynamic applications and the infrastructure that runs them. Dynamic applications use service-based architectures. They use mobile and browser-based applications. They use dynamic provisioning of resources. And they provision those resources when they need them, as they need them on the fly. Provisioning is an important aspect of a modern dynamic application. Your performance monitoring tools need to grow, need to understand how to manage all aspects of your dynamic applications. Because change is a new norm. Dynamic applications use a dynamic infrastructure run by an operations team. Infrastructure used to be static. It was stationary, it was understandable. Your operations team used to maintain spreadsheets of serial numbers of your servers and know exactly what was going on with every single one of those servers. And they like that level of control. But in modern applications, they live in a more dynamic world. Servers are coming and going as needed. Resources, Docker containers are being launched and terminated as needed. And developers are intimately involved in this process of building what the application requires from an infrastructure standpoint. Because as the infrastructure grows and shrinks and needs to meet the needs, your application is intimately involved in that process. In a static world, operations was in control. In a dynamic world, the application is in control of your resources, of your infrastructure. So why does this matter? Well, in this dynamic world, if you don't change, you don't understand how your system operates under change, you'll waste time firefighting. You'll point fingers to other teams and to other members within your team. You'll lose money. You'll make customers unhappy. And as we all know, unhappy customers tell other customers, or anybody, whether they're customers or not. It's not a good situation to be in. So success involves all three types of measurements. Is the software working? Is it meeting the customer's needs? And is it meeting your business needs? All three of these things are interconnected. It's all about the data. So I want to show you a typical e-commerce website. And imagine I've got a mobile app that you can use to purchase something from a website or a shop of some sort. So Bob does a transaction to purchase something, and that transaction goes through your entire system. hits a database, hits a bunch of services, comes back out, and he gets a good experience. 300 milliseconds later, his transaction is complete. Sally, she logs in, but this time she does something and the database is slow or a service is slow and she gets a much worse experience. Sally's unhappy, Bob is not. Sally won't be a customer anymore. But typical external performance management tools typically will give you averaged or sampled results. On average, the application was a bit slow, 0.9 seconds, but that's not too bad. What you lose, though, is you lose the granularity. You lose the details. And the real answer is in those details. The real answer is on how your application is performing. Those details matter. In a modern digital application, a modern dynamic application, monitoring can be done just by taking average or sampled data. You need to take data at all points in your application process and all areas of your data, and that data has to be for all transactions. You collect tons and tons and tons of data. In fact, in a typical dynamic application, you collect more monitoring data than the business data your application requires. You have more data that's related to monitoring your application than you do the data that your business requires to function. And it keeps growing continuously. Every day, every second, everything that anyone does, every transaction needs to be kept. Because if anybody's using that application, you have to collect the data exactly how they're using it and how the infrastructure behind it worked. All of it is important. In all parts of your application, whether you're talking about your business metrics or whether you're talking about your server monitoring, all of it is important. It all generates data that you must use to work together to analyze how your application is performing. So what data is it that you need? What data is important to you? What's your priority? Are you more worried about figuring out if you're open for business? Is your website working? Or are you more worried about, is your application working? What's the priority for you within your company? What's the priority for your company itself? These are two different ways to look at the same problem. So to help you decide what's right for your company, I want to build a framework here for analyzing your data and talk about the different types of analyzing data, analytics data, performance data that you might consider monitoring, that you might consider collecting in order to make your application work, in order to make sure your application stays working. So let's build this framework. We'll start with business data. Business data is about revenue. It might be about cart volume of customers who are doing checkouts. It depends on what you're selling, but these are the business metrics that make up what your business cares about, the business results themselves. But in order to assure those business results, you must monitor and analyze your customer experiences. These are things like conversion rates, social engagements, end user performance, like we were showing on the previous set of slides. These are all the important metrics that matter for the customer experience of your applications. But in order to have a proper customer experience, you have to gather application performance and infrastructure performance monitoring. This is giving you information about slow queries, about how app performance per scale, things like that. Understanding how your application works and whether it is working and doing what it needs to do in order to make that customer experience. Customer experience 101 is that performance of your website matters. If your website doesn't perform the way your customers want it to perform, they won't stay customers. But kind of parallel to the application performance is service quality. It doesn't matter whether or not you have a great website that performs well when it works if it doesn't work all the time. Service quality is important. And these metrics that you care about are things like uptime, number of application errors or percent of errors that your website creates, whether you have successful deploys, those sorts of things. And on the other side, parallel to that is you're now in a dynamic environment with a dynamic engineering team. You're doing continuous deployments, continuous installs, continuous updates. The engineering teams are doing things continuously. They have their own metrics that they care about. How long does it take them to fix a problem? How long does it take to recognize that a problem needs to be fixed? How many deploys did they perform today, this hour, last week? How many of those failed? How long did it take for them to detect that the deployments failed? These are the sorts of measurements that they care about. And all of these measurements are important. This forms a framework of a journey for your company. As your company determines what data it needs in order to monitor and in order to measure whether the company is working the way you want it to, you'll be looking at all of this analytic data. Your company can start this journey anywhere it wants. It may focus on wanting to make sure the business is open and is performing from a business standpoint, or you may focus on the application and whether the application is performing. It doesn't matter whether you start top down, bottom up. You will, as a company, follow this plan. You will start at one end or the other, and you will work your way as you mature in your performance journey into all of these areas of monitoring. And we're lucky enough here to have one of our customers here today too. Gannett is a company that has many properties, including USA Today. And Brian Lieberman, who's a systems engineer for the Platform as a Service delivery group within Gannett, is here. And we're gonna have a Q&A session here on stage talking about this, and then hopefully open up to questions from the audience as well. So Brian, if you'd come on stage. Thanks for coming. Bring this over. Go ahead and have a seat. Thanks for coming, Brian.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, great. So why don't you start out by telling a little bit about Gannett?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Gannett is a traditional publishing company. We've been around for quite a while. Most of you probably know us better under our flagship brand of USA Today. And we pull all of our other brands under the USA Today network. So we have over 100 local to national properties that comprise of some you may have heard of, like the Arizona Republic, the Baxter Bulletin, AZ Central. And so what that lets us do is leverage our local coverage and also cover the stories that are nationally important under the flagship brand of USA Today as well.
Cool. You're in the Platform as a Service group. Can you tell me a little bit about that group and what it does?
Yeah, so my primary role is under the Infrastructure and Automation group, and Platform as a Service provides provisioning and automation services to the rest of the development teams inside of USA Today and Gannett so that they can publish their apps in an automated and fast fashion.
Cool. Now, like a lot of digital companies nowadays are turning to becoming more and more of a digital-first company, if you will. And that's obviously happening to Gannett as well. Can you talk a little bit about the motivations and the drivers that are making that happen for you and why that's important?
Yeah, and I don't think it's a secret that, being in the media space and us coming from a very traditional publishing background, it's very fast transition and transformative period for us to go into being a digital-first company. And so for us, there's two main drivers behind that. We want to be fast and we want to be cheap. And so for us to get that speed and efficiency, bringing all of these processes and being digital first and leading with digital as our primary source for all of our content is really important for us to be able to achieve those goals.
Cool. Now, like a lot of companies, and in different industries, it's different days. There's drivers of traffic. In retail, it's the holiday season, and in every company, it's a different area. You have drivers as well. What are some of the drivers for you as far as traffic volume to your site and traffic to your system?
Yeah, so the obvious one for most people is probably breaking news events, right? But the really unique problem for us with that is we don't get to schedule breaking news. So we wake up one morning and there's a world leader that's passed away. We get several multiples of our traffic in an uninspected fashion. And that presents a really unique and challenging problem on how to deal with that. It's not like a concert sales where we have a planned on-sale event for our tickets. So there's a couple times a year, though, where we get the opportunity to have planned events. And some of those might be the Super Bowl, or the biggest one that came up most recently is the US election. And so for us, we get the chance to know that we have a planned event with increased traffic that we can put some effort into making sure that we get that right and we can serve our customers in the best possible fashion.
Yeah, when I was at Amazon Retail, we had obviously Black Friday, Cyber Monday, but we also had what we called Johnny Carson events. That's when Johnny Carson died, suddenly all of the products of all the VCR tapes, they'll date me a little bit, of Johnny Carson in heavy supply. That changes all your caching and everything and all sorts of problems. So we end up calling those unplanned events Johnny Carson events.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting thing you bring up is, typically we're big on caching at all layers. We have our CDN that serves our customers. We also cache, our back end where all of our data is persisted to retrieve article content and stuff like that. When it comes to events like elections and sports, real-time type data, we can't really rely on that crutch of caching as much. That also presents a bigger problem for us is how do we keep the most up-to-date results and not really have that caching to hold us up as much as we'd like.
Yeah, so let's now shift and talk more about that specifically. So the US election, for those who aren't from the United States or haven't been near a TV or anything recently, the United States held their election for the president on November 8th, and it's a biggest political event in our nation on a 4-year cycle, and so it was a huge event this year, obviously, as well. So there was a lot of planning that went into that day. So can you tell us a little bit about what that day meant for you and what type of planning goes into managing a day like that?
Yeah, and so for us, we expected that we would obviously get a very large traffic lift. And for us, elections is, people typically think results night, right? But for us, the coverage actually spans almost 3 days. We have, the coverage leading up into that night, and our biggest traffic lift actually occurs the next morning when people are waking up to say, how did last night shake out? I got tired and I went to bed, so I don't even actually know what happened, right? So they actually wake up the next morning and we actually get a large traffic lift around 9 a.m. Eastern, around there, where people are waking up and checking the results and saying, who's our next president, right? So, going into planning on that and saying, we know we're gonna get a huge traffic lift, but we don't know exactly what it is. And so basically we try to test, we load test all levels and layers of our system for as much traffic as we can throw at it to try to raise our level of confidence to say the systems that we built can withstand what turned out to be for us actually the largest amount of unique users and page impressions that we've had in the company's history.
And it actually matters which pages they're looking at too, right? You can't always predict that in advance. And
we can't predict that in advance. We know that the election service page is probably going to be the largest, but a lot of the instrumentation we have around that helps us sort of figure that out. But until we start seeing those page views come in, it's a little bit of unpredictability.
So that's the theory. Let's talk about the practice. Yep. How did the day go for you?
So for us, it was a huge win. We stayed available, which is the number one thing. We introduced our brand to millions, tens of millions of new users and new unique users, which is always really positive for our company, giving them a good elections experience. And we managed to stay up and have a really big success. And that's a big win for our team and I think for Gannett as a whole.
Yeah, cool. So did you have any challenge? I'm assuming you had some challenges. There were some problems during the day, or some things you were obviously able to meet the demand. But what were some of the challenges you ran into, and how did you deal with those?
Yeah, so like I said, we had an unprecedented level of traffic that night for us. For me personally, I'd never built systems that seen that level of traffic. So like I mentioned earlier, we don't have that crutch as much to rely on caching. And so when we're fetching things like the elections data to present in the page, it goes back to our API management tier and goes back to data stores to fetch that data. And because of their increased requests, it's a lot of stress on the downstream API tier. And so for us, it's not as trivial to scale horizontally when you have persistent data stores and things like that. And so we stress that pretty bad, but we managed to fight through those issues and never had any user impacting issues. So that's really what's most important for us.
So when you think about about availability and scalability, and they're very much related, but they're different things too. Which of those two is the bigger challenge for you? Is it to keep your system properly scaled, or is it to keep it actually running? What's the hardest part?
For us, those two things are always intertwined. If we're underscaled because we got a sudden influx of traffic, it's very likely that we're not going to be available for much longer under that situation. So being properly scaled means being available for us, at least. And it's easy to scale your front-end web tier for the most part. I think most people have figured out how to do that easily these days. But like I mentioned, when you start getting down into the more persistent data stores, your SQL servers of the world, and things like that, it becomes a lot bigger of a challenge. We're talking about cross-region replication, for example. Those become a lot harder problems to solve, and scaling those are a lot more challenging.
Cool. So obviously election day was a big day. You'll have other big days in the future, certainly 4 years, another election day, but you'll have other big days as well, big news days. You mentioned Super Bowl, and there's another one. What lessons are you taking from election day that you think will apply and help you continue to do a good job as your traffic grows for future events?
Yeah, so for elections, we got to prove out a new technology stack, which was really cool for us. We ran it on Kubernetes and Docker, which was the first time we'd actually done that in production. Some people called us crazy for taking a first stab at it on election night, but it offered a lot of really big advantages for us.
Actually, would want to reiterate that and make sure you said that.
Yeah.
You used Docker and Kubernetes for the first time
Yes.
during election.
Yeah, and then the Google guys called us crazy when we told them that too. Yeah. Well, and so and obviously under a situation like that, we would have loved an unlimited amount of time to be more prepared for something like that. But proving that out and saying, hey, it worked and it was really good, and we took the biggest advantage I think most people realize with that is the speed of deployments. And so and looking back in retrospect and saying, hey, we were able to fight some of the capacity issues because we weren't the only ones covering elections in Amazon that night. And the speed that it gave us mid-election night to say, hey, I know Lee talked about earlier in his slides, how can we shorten the feedback cycle and get people closer to the data? We can have a production bug reported and have it fixed in production in minutes. So for us, if we could move more of our API stack into Docker and run that on Kubernetes as well, that would have been really advantageous for us. And I think we're going to continue moving in that direction as we keep proving it out and tuning it and making it better.
Cool. So the ultimate goal is your entire stack will be in that environment, or something like that.
Yeah, and just getting better and faster in general, I think is going to be a big advantage for us.
Cool. So let's talk about of high availability and focus on that for a while. So the ultimate leading question is, what tools do you use that help you improve your keep your availability high?
Yeah, well, so Relic is the big one, right? And there's different aspects of that. So making sure that we see all the infrastructure level metrics and collecting just data like that as well. But it's also important to monitor, I think, the user experience and that side of it, and making sure that ultimately, just because we have set thresholds and alerting, I'm sure most people at some point have said, oh, my system failed, but I didn't get alerted, right? And so we're down, but nobody knew until somebody called and complained to customer service, right? So for us, monitoring those metrics is just a single piece of that.
Okay. So I talked about the journey, the digital intelligence stack, and I think actually I can go back to that. So where do you see your biggest, where's your biggest focus right now in this journey? Where are you and where do you see you moving?
So we came in as traditional, sort of operationally minded people. And our team, started off, we had 40 development teams, and we started off building what we call the platform as a service at Gannett roughly 2 years ago. And so we said, all right, we're going to collect these operational metrics, the disks, the CPU, memory type metrics, and monitor our systems, and that was cool. Then we got into application monitoring and performance and browser, and how's the user experience? And so we started collecting all this data. We have a ton of data, and it's really hard, and I know I've gotten to some talks and Lee's thoughts about it. We have all this data, but what do we do with it? How do we make sense of it? Was it real value? So now we have the application teams and the developers have direct access to that data, and they can see how each line of their code performs. But for us, the real value, and we're not quite there yet, so we're sort of in the middle right now, is we have all this data. We can actually see, for example, on our election page, which candidate our users are clicking on their profiles more. And there's some invaluable intelligence to be derived from that. And so how do we take that and say, and go to the business, the bean counters, the finance people, the ad ops people, and say, we have this intelligence. It doesn't really mean much to me as somebody who wants to keep the lights on and make sure that everything works, but I think you guys would really care about this. So having the business side more involved in ingesting and making sense of this data, I think, is where the really higher order value of it is.
So you've really been the bottom-up approach.
Yeah, definitely. So we started, in the lower tier, and we're trying to work our way, basically spread through the business in an organic way, but push our way through and say, hey, we got all these cool things that we really think are valuable to the business.
So, okay, cool. Let's talk a little bit about AWS now. Where this is AWS's big show. You obviously have a big presence here too. You obviously use a lot of AWS.
Yep.
Tell me the role that AWS performs. Are you a hybrid customer with your own data centers as well as the cloud? How do you make use of the cloud? How is the cloud important to you?
So we present our clouds to our development teams via Scalar, which is a cloud management platform. And this provides self-service provisioning to our development teams to request resources. And so this sits on top of AWS. And for us, we're very heavy in AWS. We're primarily in AWS. We also own a couple of physical data centers, which we've had for quite a while before we went into AWS. And so we have some OpenStack there as well. But for us, we're going to continue to push into AWS and the cloud in general. And that involves also making sure that our apps, it's not lift and shift, as like people like to call that, but we want to make our applications cloud native and really take advantage of the fact that they're running in the cloud.
So so to you, the cloud isn't just another data center.
No.
It is much more than that. The dynamic nature we were talking about earlier is really what you care about.
Yeah, and for us, we're really big on disposable infrastructure with that. Yeah. And so we're heavy users of Chef as well. And so we don't believe in creating a server and leaving it there for 4 years to do its thing on the side. We will throw away our instances quite frequently. I think the average age of our instances is probably less than a day. So we will continue to spin up thousands of instances to do deploys and throw them away and move them around because that also lets us build for failure. And so we can throw things away, they can fail, we can reprovision and not be concerned about that.
Cool. Now, you brought some charts with you
Yeah.
tonight. Let's go and take a look at those. You tell us, these are all election day, election night
Yeah,
results.
so these are our exciting pretty graphs from election day.
Okay.
So this is some charts that we've from monitoring our Kubernetes infrastructure, and what was important for us from this perspective is to understand how many containers, where they're running, and one of the big problems we actually had leading up to election night was I/O throughput on our Kubernetes clusters, and so that's another thing that we were looking for. And making sure that we had insight into our Kubernetes workers were being well spread and scheduled and not having an overload on one side. So these are some of the metrics we were capturing using actually a New Relic infrastructure agent. So that let us have that level of confidence that we knew that the system was healthy throughout the night. And this was just up on the TV all night, and all of us were spread around the country and in a war room till 4 a.m, making sure that we were good.
Cool. So I'm noticing the spikes in the I/O reads per second,
Yep.
the lower left. So what are those traffic volume spikes?
Yeah, so if you actually see the timestamp, it started right around 6 p.m. when results started to close on the East Coast, and then carried into the next morning.
It's
Probably.
extremely spiky. It's like almost there's nothing except this.
Yeah, and so what actually is most likely happening there is we had about 170 code deploys that night for the various services, including the web and the API tier. Midnight, we actually moved the API tier onto the Kubernetes as well because we had to fix an issue and couldn't get enough capacity to deploy the servers. So they decided to stick in a container and deploy it on Kubernetes. That's pretty brave. But
Okay, I gotta stop you there. I gotta go through this again. So, election night, first time Kubernetes, first time Docker, and 170 deploys during the election night.
Yes.
And so,
I wouldn't recommend that approach.
listen to that. It works. That's the way dynamic companies make their applications dynamic during critical times, and it works.
Yeah, and so for us, it was important that we can shorten that feedback cycle and get the code out there and the fixes out there and keep streaming those results to our users. But yeah, it's spiky. We get bursts of traffic that probably correlates very well with, hey, there's a lull in when election results are coming in. You get the East Coast, and then maybe an hour, and then you get another burst. So yeah.
Cool. You've got another slide here.
Yeah, so this is a fancy, we had a big lift in traffic graph. So this is just the origin hits for the page that we were monitoring and instrumenting for the election results. And so, and it shows the spread of pages. And this is across all of our brands at origin. And you see we have a lot of page views to different endpoints on the election service. But like I said earlier, there's a lot of intelligence that can be derived from these pages as well, because we can see how long users are staying on the page. And for us, we care about, is there a performance reason that they're leaving our pages or not? Or the product people might care and say, if we change the layout of the page, is that driving our users away? But I think the business as well might care, say, hey, we're publishing content that's not fitting, to what our message or something that our users find interesting. So there's a lot of different value to derive from these types of metrics, and not just operationally minded people.
Cool. And I think we have one more chart here.
Yeah, so the really cool thing here is we have a feature team called the API team within Platform as a Service that developed a service that tags releases inside of New Relic when new code goes out, so that it inserts a marker basically in our graphs so that we can correlate those to changes in metrics. And this is an example of that. So you see that there's a vertical gray bar where a release went out, and there's a change in the CPU usage right immediately when that happened. And so for us, being able to correlate those as well is really valuable.
Cool. So I'd like to open up the floor now to questions. There's 2 microphones here. If you could come up and stand up by the microphone, I'd appreciate it. They are recording this session, so we need you to use the microphone. Would you like to start?
Yeah, so my question is, how do you handle basically the SLA in terms of the publishing and the fast updates versus the caching on that?
Yeah.
And how much fun are you having there with the end users and saying, my update isn't coming in as fast as I want. And do you actually have an SLA with your editors and whatnot?
Yeah, we do have an SLA that is set by, I believe, the editorial. And so they say our SLA, and we're agreeing to give our users, I think it was something like 90 seconds from when the AP publishes results. So we're reading the AP stream like everybody else was. And so they say that it has to be live on the site to all users within 90 seconds of receiving those results. And
Does that include also with the breaking news stuff? Because that's going to
that's separate. That wasn't for elections. For breaking news, we use different TTLs on the CDN. That's not as aggressive. But yeah, so that's all set by editorial though.
Okay.
And so they say this is what you need to do, and we solve the engineering challenges around how to make that work in a reliable fashion.
How do you handle stuff where, breaking news, you can cache that pretty quick?
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't mean to go to a double question, but weather isn't always an interesting thing to me, where you got school closings and other things, and where updates, and you get a mixture of that, where it's so much harder to cache that. Is that just more handled on your horizontal scaling, or is that?
Yeah, so, and the interesting thing about breaking news, there's a couple approaches. Since we have a lot of local brands, a lot of those types of breaking news events will hit just those sites. But a lot of times when that happens, when you have caching, because especially it's a large breaking event, like an attack or a death, right? You get a flood of traffic that will hit before it can actually be cached and warned. So we need to take that hit. And when you have a local property, they might not be prepared for that. So staying up is a challenge, and that's a lot where the advantages of some things like Docker come in, because we can scale that out way faster than provisioning VMs. But a lot of it's just horizontal scaling at the web layer, because the data tier will cache the results, at least for the backend, so we won't crush that after it gets into cache, and then making sure the web stays available until our CDN can catch the rest.
So basically on updates, you're just slamming the cache to clear it out for that. So,
Yep.
Yeah, all right. Thanks, sir.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, so I do also want to announce that Brian, as well as Eric and the rest of his team, are going to be at the New Relic booth at 4 o'clock today, and they'll go through a Q&A session as well, some more questions from us, as well as be able to answer your questions as well. But what else can you tell me about how your night went? Yeah, give me one other fact about what's going on. We've got a little bit more time, so let's keep going.
Yeah, about election night?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, why don't you? Thank you. Thinking on my feet here. So thank you.
Gannett's a sort of, I think of newspapers as like the companies that are dying, not cool technology companies. Maybe talk a little bit about like what it's like to work at a place where you're doing Kubernetes, Docker, like all the cool kid stuff. And maybe talk about that transition a little bit.
You stole the very last question. Go ahead.
Yeah. No.
How cool is it to work at Gannett?
I think it's actually awesome, and I'll plug and say that if you guys are interested, we're hiring. We're looking for top talent. Just throw that out there for a room full of talented people. And so you come find us at the booth later as well. And we've got open jobs. We hire across the country. We have quite a large number of remote folks. But working at Gannett's really awesome. A lot of people have that thought of being a traditional publishing company. We're the big dinosaur with the newspapers that are in the hotels. But we, like Lee mentioned earlier, we're leading digital first. Digital is really most important for us, and it's the best and most efficient way, at least we think, that we can deliver our content to our readers. And that lets us get across all platforms as well. So we're in mobile, we're in smart TVs, we're in desktop, Windows 10 apps, we're in web. And so being able to do that and then work on all the new cool technologies is a really exciting thing. And Kubernetes and Docker, it's a hard problem to solve, and being able to do that on election night and say, hey, we got this right and we served our users, and we did something that a lot of people think might be really crazy, but it was really fun and really challenging problem to solve. And at the end of the day, it's really rewarding too.
So would you do that again? Would you do that massive of a change?
Yeah, I mean, in retrospect, it's definitely really stressful. But I think at the end of the day, it's something you put a feather in your cap and say,
Yeah.
you know, I did that and it was really cool. And go and say, hey, you know, this is a problem we solved. And go to other people and say, how did you, you know, cover election night? Or how did you guys cover major concert ticket sales? How are you solving these types of problems? And it's good to just talk to people and figure those things out, you know, because everybody has a different approach to those types of problems. But for us, it was, you know, I'd probably do it again. And like I said, if we had more time, we probably would have done it even more.
Great, okay. Any other questions? Yeah, another question over here.
Hey, so obviously USA Today is probably your biggest customer, but you said you have a bunch of different other application teams that you're working with. So I'm doing something similar, but I was wondering, all those application teams probably have different needs for their infrastructure and different stuff that they're doing. And how do you guys effectively manage all those different needs while still kind of operating on one singular team?
Yeah, that's definitely a huge challenge. You know, we have 40 some odd development teams who, some of them writing Node apps, some of them write Golang, Python, Ruby. So it's a different, it's a challenge of doing a one-size-fits-all approach versus, you know, it's hard when we have, you know, a team of maybe 20 people to be really white-gloved, catered approach. So for us, you know, we have a couple of different approaches. We have embedded resources in those teams that have some of the operational knowledge and are very closely tied to some of the work we're doing and can help those teams along with, you know, things like writing chef cookbooks or just best practices around configuration and writing Docker files and things like that. You know, we also developed things like the Light platform where, you know, they say, we really don't want to write chef code or things like that. As much as we would love them to be more involved, we, you know, give them an easier path to deploy their app, but it's going to be in an opinionated way that we think is the best practice for them to get their apps out there. So there's definitely different approaches for different levels of teams that want to get involved, but it's also a cultural battle. We're coming from a place where we didn't have a digital presence, you know, not very long ago, to now we are moving towards a really transformative period where digital's first and it's at the forefront. And so shifting the company culture into adopting all of these new technologies in a very rapid pace is definitely a challenge.
Mm-hmm. So you kind of push people or try and help people to do the chef cookbooks and the Docker containers and stuff like that, but also allow the other customers who have different views on things to try and use some of their other tools that they see, or do you kind of restrict that?
No, we want to foster what we call the Gannett development community internally, and so we accept pull requests back to, you know, our maintained cookbooks that our team writes, or our scripts and automation tools and things like that. You know, if they have contributions they want to make, we totally welcome that, because it also takes a load off of our team for developing those things. And if they have cool ideas and they say, hey, we want to do these things, we totally welcome that, because we're not the only ones that have ideas in the world. And so, and then we think that's positive, and that's how we're all going to grow together. You know, but as long as it's within, you know, our established best practices, and, you know, opening security groups to the world is probably not like the best thing to do. So that's not a contribution we would welcome, but yeah, so we totally welcome that though.
So
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So your teams are very distributed. Are individual teams distributed, or do you have teams in one location, but you have lots of teams all over the place?
Well, so we're based right outside DC. That's where our headquarters office is. But you know, given all of our brands that spread out very nationally, we have development teams that are spread out in Phoenix and Cincinnati and Indianapolis. So we're all very spread out, and that presents unique problems as well.
How does monitoring help keep those groups together? Does it help?
Yeah, it does, because all of the data is still ingested in one place. So we can all have the same way of talking about our monitoring and tools.
Same language.
Same language, right? You have a question?
Oh.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah, so traditionally with monitoring, you would have an agent on the servers, but now we're moving to serverless architecture.
Yep.
Have you used some of the serverless, like say the RDS databases or Lambda or anything else that AWS offers? And if so, how are you monitoring those? And what tools are you using to monitor those?
So we do. We use Lambda. Actually, I'm probably the biggest user of Lambda, much to the dismay of my manager. But that's actually a really hard problem, and I can plug New Relic, I think, just came out like this week with Lambda integration. I actually haven't had a chance to play with it, but that actually might solve part of that problem is hey, we can actually monitor the performance of our Lambda applications. I think it ingests some stuff to CloudWatch right now, but it's not 100%, and testing that stuff also becomes really hard to get it like fully fleshed out into the CI process and things like that. We also do use RDS. Since we don't have a huge DBA team, I'm not a DBA, our developers certainly aren't DBAs, and so we make use of those services where it makes sense because it lets us get out of the way of trying to figure out the best processes of provisioning and managing a database and backing it up and everything like that, and just focus on what we're good at, which is writing content apps.
And keeping the configuration of all your databases consistent and working correctly.
Yeah, it becomes a big mess that I don't even understand really, so.
I will put a plug in for our infrastructure product. Come take a look at it at our booth, and we try and solve a lot of those problems you're talking about. And like you mentioned, and thank you for that, we just announced support for Lambda on Tuesday. So come take a look at that.
All right, thank you.
Can you share some of the best practices or gotcha problem that you ran into with using New Relic?
Best practices around using New Relic? For us, the biggest thing is we like to call it a single pane of glass, right? So we want to grab all the data from all the different places and put them in one place. And so
do you actually have just one account in New Relic for everybody?
Yep. And when we have acquisitions and everything else, we also bring them onto the same account so that we can keep all the data in one place. Everybody can see, all the things. So for us, we have the infrastructure agent running on our servers, so we get all of the system level data. Then we pull in the AWS account, so that's correlated with our instance tagging. We're very big on tagging to the dismay of some of the companies who are trying to index the 300 tags we have. They're not huge fans of that. New Relic just totally cool with it though, which is awesome. So, but and then the APM stuff. So that requires more working with the developers sometimes to say, hey, let's start instrumenting your app, and then getting that trace level view into the app as well. So there's lots of different layers around it, but for us, the biggest thing is that at the end of the day, we have the release tagging where we can say, hey, we got this marker right here, the release went out. We can see with the infrastructure stuff that it affected our metrics, and then we have the tagging to say, this line of code on this box behaved poorly in this farm that's owned by this team. Right, so just having it all in one place and then being able to correlate everything is a really big value, at least for me, but I'm speaking as operationally minded folk, right?
In terms of business analytics, to what extent are you guys doing business analytics using New Relic?
Not a ton yet, but we want
to
be, not a ton yet, but we want to be there because there's a lot of value. Even just taking all the metrics that we've captured and doing the business analytics on that, because it's all there, we can see where the users are going and what they're doing. And
so for the business metric that you guys are sending to New Relic, are you guys using custom metrics or how you guys?
Yeah, we leverage a lot of custom metrics. So some of it just comes naturally from tracking the apps themselves anyway, and where the users are clicking through the site and how long they're doing those types of things. But we also do push some custom metrics as well. And I think once we start wrapping other sections of the business into these tools, they might have different ideas about the metrics that they want to get in there too. I'm not a business analytics person or a finance person or anything like that, so that sort of stretches where I know and my knowledge goes, but I assume that they'll want to get their own custom metrics in there, maybe stuff around ads and things like that.
Sorry if I'm hogging all the questions. One last question. Regarding custom metric, do you guys have any standards or best practices in place on how to namespace them, for example, that kind of thing?
Yeah, since we have so many teams, namespacing actually becomes really important so that nobody steps on each other's toes. So typically what we do is we just prefix anything they use that comes. This actually goes with cookbooks for chef. It goes with service discovery and metrics and tagging as well. We prefix it all with their team name basically, so that we know that it's unique across the platform, so that nobody overwrites each other's stuff.
Thank you. I guess one more question.
So I know this talk isn't really about containers, but I'm just a little bit curious about your use of containers. And can you just talk a little bit about how you make the breakdown between what you've containerized and what is not containerized? In particular, like web servers, the web tier. Have you gone the route of containerizing that, or is it just backend services and background stuff?
So that sort of steps into an interesting sort of what our role is within the organization. We want to set best practices, but we also don't want to tell people, hey, you can't do things either. So it's sort of striking a balance there. But the way our team sees it is there's no hardline approach that says like, oh, hey, you can't stick on the container. As long as like security-wise or anything else, you're not doing anything that's really against common sense or best practices. But what I will say is what we're still very exploratory on is things like Couchbase and persistent data in general is obviously a really big challenge with containers and Docker. So we're working on that. We got some really cool DBA guys that are working on figuring out sort of best approach to that, because I think it still would provide a lot of advantages for us. But something like that would be a bigger challenge. We are already very spread out with microservices across all of our organizations, and we're very chatty with each other because all the teams our content team is pulling from or the CMS team is pulling from the content team, right? And so they all talk to each other. We're all very broken down microservices. So for us, it made a lot of sense, and it was a very natural progression to go a lot towards that route.
Sure. Cool.
Thank you.
Hi. I would like to ask about the metrics, but for media content. How do you track this experience, user experience?
For media content?
Video, video on demand, all the video that reproduce about the site.
So a lot of our media and stuff is hosted out of, I think, third-party providers. So a lot of that's tracked over on a third-party business side, I think. So I don't know a ton about tracking that. I don't know if we're doing a ton of that instrumenting-wise within our platform, at least off the top of my head. So it's sort of outside of what I know.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No problem, thanks.
Okay. So just a reminder, 4 o'clock at our booth, and once again, it's a great place to work, right?
It's awesome.
Okay.
Come find me. We can get you the link to the job site if you want to apply, because it's awesome.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you very much.